Good morning, everyone. So I know because Carol told me that the video starts and gives just some moments of whoever is running the video some time to look blankly into the screen while everyone else waits for the stuff to begin. Because for me and for us, it says that we have not gone live yet, when in fact we have. And so there will be very little awkwardness, although I'm sure there were a few seconds of it, at least, of silent awkwardness. We'll see if there's any awkwardness in what I have to share with you. But I wanted to share some reflections with you all that, as always, are just kind of a smattering of where I am at this present moment. So not only are we in the 10th or 11th week of a radically altered reality for all of us, and especially at Highland, but also I myself, I'm on my own journey, and life is happening for me. And that includes preaching tonight for Friday church and this Sunday. So I am trying to make sense of the world that we are in and put that in conversation with the lectionary text, which has to do with the ascension of Jesus. And I know Carol read the Acts passage earlier this week, a charitable reading, I told her. But so we've already kind of started together this theology of thinking together in conversation with Scripture. And it's my job, or calling, I should say, this weekend especially, to find the good news that is in it. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that I'm struggling with. I like to talk with the men's fellowship often about things kind of as a test group whenever I'm getting ready to preach. We meet typically in the before times. We met at 8 a.m. in person, and I was fortunate to join them at 8 a.m. this morning every Friday. But today you all will be my focus group, so it's not just the men's fellowship, it's anyone who is willing to join us live. And so where I am really is I have been struggling with my role as a minister to do what I think is what I'm supposed to do, which is to offer encouragement and something that, an encouragement, I mean, I don't mean like cheap positivity, but I mean something in the messages that I bring, my understanding of God and of our Christian narrative and the stories and life of Jesus. I feel like I am supposed to offer something that gives those who listen courage, affirmation, and something positive to walk away with, given the world that we live in. But I've really been struggling recently because the world that we live in, as you all know, is not as it should be. And there have been a number of things that in particular have really kept me from feeling like it is easy to get in front of the congregation and speak a word of hope. And so those two things in particular might not hit white consciousness in our city as it should without churches like Highland speaking up. And so, the two things that I have, one of which I've touched on before, is the death of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And I really have not let that go, in particular because what happened to Ahmaud was a lynching. And there is a long history of lynching in our country, including in our state of Kentucky, that if you read about it, it becomes really hard to differentiate some things that have happened in our own history from things that we might typically think of as taking place in Nazi Germany or elsewhere. So that has been really heavy on my mind in the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And then, at the same time as, we started to realize nationally what has gone on in Georgia, we received news of, in the process of the execution of a no-knock warrant by LMPD, Breonna Taylor, a local citizen and frontline worker, EMT, was killed as her boyfriend responded with his own defense of their home. And there's a lot of details, and I think maybe for some people some controversy there. For me, I don't feel that there's a lot that I am uncertain about, although I do admit there are plenty of details that we'll never know, those of us who weren't there. But the reality is that an innocent, unarmed woman was killed in the process of a common practice. And so, a common practice, which, if we are honest, does not happen to white people in the same way it happens to Black Americans. Black Americans experience police violence to an extent that is disproportionate and unjust. It's also true that Black Americans, if they attempt to exercise their Second Amendment rights or are perceived to be exercising their Second Amendment rights, they are often criminalized or killed in situations where white folks otherwise would walk away unharmed. And, if you're curious about these things, about no-knock warrants and about, the disproportionate protection of Second Amendment rights in our country, I'd be glad to have a further conversation with you. It's something that these are things that I'm passionate about and would love to talk about. But I'm not really naming those things to incite kind of a difficult and hard conversation for you this morning. I'm just trying to name some of the things that I'm thinking about that are really have made it hard in the past couple of weeks to do what I feel like I'm supposed to do, which is to be encouraging. And so last week I just missed Friday because I was too exhausted to speak honestly without being a bit negative. And in unhealthier seasons, I've probably preached sermons or given lectures or conversations without that kind of self-censoring, which some people like, but my colleagues from time to time have offered that I might reconsider such things. And so I missed last week, but today I want to talk with you honestly and see what we can come up with together. And so those things are troubling me. Also, more than the innocent lives of two Black Americans being taken in two different contexts. One, a lynching in the state of Georgia. The other, during the execution of a no-knock warrant here in Louisville. Those things are closer together, I think, than we are comfortable admitting. But we're not going to get into that today. But those things have really been making it hard for me. And then thinking about these things don't just happen. These people did not just randomly die. There are systems and structures in place, institutions in our society which have produced these things. And so it's really easy for me to follow that all the way down and to all of a sudden feel like I can't do anything meaningful to help. And then once I'm there, despair is not far away. And so what I'm trying to figure out this weekend is how to talk about the ascension of Jesus in a passage in Luke 24 and have that be like a hopeful thing. Because my intuition or my first reading, and I'm a more cynical person, is really to, imagine, we do not really remember sometimes that the disciples didn't have the whole story in front of them to see. So we have reason to read Luke and be like, well, this happens before, this happens later, therefore, don't worry, things are going to be okay. But if we try to put ourselves in the places of the disciples, which I'm going to try to maybe expand upon, but not too much, probably be even shorter than this reflection because I'm rambling. But basically, the disciples had been through everything that they had been through. Some of them believing they were participating in a political revolution, others believing that the Messiah had come to liberate Israel and the people of Israel. They were thrust into this and experienced all the miraculous and difficult things that were included along the journey of being a disciple. Then Jesus is executed. Then, if we take the story at face value, Jesus returns, but then ascends into heaven. And along the way says, all right, you all can handle it. I'll be back. And Jesus has not come back yet in a strict sense. So we might think, those first disciples who are like, okay, he left, but he's going to come back. And there's even the question, like, when are you going to come back and restore Israel? But they're told, you all are the ones that are going to have to take up this work for the time being. So the disciples then left are looking around like, well, I guess it's us. And so the idea of being left, in some sense, at face value, is not exactly comforting. If we stop there, and it's easy to stop there because that's what just the scripture for the day includes, and it's actually probably closer to what the disciples experienced because they didn't have the whole story afterwards. And I'd argue that maybe we don't have the whole story afterwards, but that's neither here nor there for the purposes of this reflection. But basically, it's like, what is the good news in that? And if we look at the world that we have and we look at the world the disciples were in, plenty that was very different, very, very different in terms of historical context and culture and values and all of those things. But the things that the disciples were overwhelmed by are some of the same things that our culture is overwhelmed by. Rampant inequality, state violence against, a population that did not all experience equality under the law, political violence and unease, so some of the things that, we find pretty common today, I think would have been familiar to the disciples as well. And so we have this ascension. Well, here's the thing. The disciples, though not having the rest of the story, we are fortunate enough to, maybe have a little bit more to find. And I was actually looking this morning, I thought all this week that, I was going to use Pima Chodron to help bring out the good news of this story. And usually what happens when I write a sermon is that on Monday, I have huge ideas. And I'm like, here's what's going to happen. And I start doing it and I start working. And then invariably around Thursday or Friday morning, I am stricken, one might say by the Lord, but I'm not really sure in all cases it is in fact the Lord, but I'm stricken with the idea that all of my preparation is for naught, and I scrap it, and then I actually start working on what I end up with. Pima Chodron is not, I don't think, what I want to offer to people. She's a Buddhist nun who is amazing, definitely, and has like radically improved my life, just reading and incorporating some of her thoughts. But like, who wants to listen to a millennial white guy read Buddhist spiritual practices from a Christian pulpit, given everything that I just named, and the fact that 40 million people have applied for unemployment, as reported in CNBC and the Washington Post and elsewhere, at the same time that billionaires are making plenty of money in the order of hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in this pandemic. How can I like say something like that to a group of people experiencing life as we're experiencing it? Never mind people in sobriety who are trying to stay sober when meetings have been disrupted for this whole time. Never mind people who are stuck at home in unsafe home conditions and abusive relationships. Like all these, people thrust into financial insecurity, parents exhausted by becoming, like, in addition to already wearing many hats, becoming a stay-at-home teacher. People dealing with the real fear of vulnerability to the illness, medical difficulties, grief, especially thinking about our seniors at Highland, so Jack Bell and Emily Moyers and Jackson Hughes and Daniel Klein, who's graduating in Iowa, and thinking about, okay, so like all of these people experiencing the world that I'm experiencing, I'm overwhelmed, and I'm going to get up there and talk about some Buddhist stuff. No. And so I have scrapped that. And what I appreciate is that in the New Zealand Book of Common Prayer, it's a book it's the New Zealand Book of Common Prayer. And if you don't know much about it, I'd be glad to send you some stuff, or you might check it out. But I found it really helpful. We Baptists don't have, in all cases, liturgy connected together in a nice printing for the whole year. And so in times that I've really struggled, or in times that I've needed to introduce the youth to something a little bit different, I've gone to the New Zealand Book of Common Prayer for help. And so what is interesting is that included in the sentences for Ascension, so we have our lectionary text, but in the Book of Common Prayer from New Zealand, one of the sentences included, the first one from Scripture, is from Matthew 28. And so what's interesting is that this sentence, which is Matthew 28, 20, verse 20, is in conversation with and direct contradiction with the experience of the disciples and ourselves, I would argue, in Luke 24 and what comes after. So we have this word from Jesus. Jesus says, "Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." And so Jesus has made a claim elsewhere that he is with us, or in another, maybe you could get to the idea that God is with us, present with us, always, even to the end of the age. Jesus called Emmanuel, I mean, it's this idea of constant presence, put in this case, this Ascension weekend, in tension with a story about a departure. So I think that is something that we have to wrestle with, to use like an overused progressive Christian terminology. We've got to wrestle with stuff and lean into it and whatnot. And so we are going to think together about that. So my mind has been bouncing around Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and some real anger. Like, I'm not talking about it with the anger that I sit with 95% of the day, but I'm trying to be helpful here. Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, income inequality and, all the struggles that I named. And I've come to the New Zealand Book of Common Prayer, reminding me via Matthew 28 of the promise of God's presence with us, even as we read a story about Jesus departing up into heaven and basically being like, "Be right back, but I won't tell you when. Also, you got to work on stuff till I come back. See you later." I don't know where I'm going with all of that yet, but you must know that my favorite part of my job at Highland, though there are many parts to it, is being with our youth. And I sent them an update about where we've been during the pandemic so far, where we're going. And I admitted the difficulty in that update of the sermon writing this weekend. But here, what I want to close with is a theology for today that I tried to offer to them. So here's what I would like for you to maybe consider. I am preaching tonight and this Sunday, and the lectionary takes us into Jesus' ascension into heaven. How I am to articulate a message of hope about Jesus departing this world while we are still in it is, at the time of this Facebook Live, which is 11:19, it is beyond me. But there is thankfully much more to the story than a first reading of Luke 24, and more than Luke 24 itself, namely what comes both before and after. So what I will say to you today is that there is not one singular theology present in the scriptures, nor is there one singular theology that we will each land upon when we read it. But this is the theology for today that I land on when I read Luke and Acts and situate it amongst consideration of the rest of the scriptures. This is the theology I land on. Give grace to yourself as God gives it to you, freely and abundantly. Know that you are not alone and that we can do hard things. Know that this, whatever this is for you, will not last forever. especially if you are overwhelmed by grief, anxiety, uncertainty, or hardship. You are not insane in this particular instance. There is more than enough to grieve. There's more than enough to be anxious about. There is more than enough uncertainty to overwhelm. And there is too much hardship, much of which existed before the pandemic and has only been made worse in the time since all this began. Even so, there is life to live now and life in what comes after. If you cannot hold the faith today, that's okay, because there are others here at Highland who will hold it for you. I miss each of you and the life we shared as it was. So I wrote this to the youth, but it's true of everyone on this Facebook Live and to Highland. I miss each of you and the life we shared as it was. But I do believe that there is more in front of us, and there's plenty to hold on to just for today. Thank you all for joining me this morning. I hope that you have a wonderful Friday. I will be preaching tonight at Friday Church, and then again 10 a.m. on Sunday, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for worship if you feel so inclined. However, I also understand that just sitting and drinking coffee and listening to the birds outside is nice too. So if you do that, I'll catch up with you at some point in the near future.